Seriously, once you know your scales, stop practicing them and move on to what I'm about to show you. Nearly everybody gets taught that improvising is a matter of applying various scales to chord changes. I was taught this and practiced scales in all the keys like a good student, and while it is necessary to know your scales, practicing them up and down is not going to help you play solos like the great improvisers you want to sound like. And that's because jazz improvisation is not a matter of just applying various scales to chord changes, despite what you may have been told. And in fact, when you just apply scales to the chords, it ends up sounding a bit amateurish. So I'm going to show you what you should be practicing instead. But first, let me give you a clear example of what I'm talking about in context. I just transcribed a solo as part of next month's material for the BetterSax studio. That's my online saxophone and improvisation study group. The saxophone player is Scott Hamilton, and the first chorus of his solo on September in the Rain is relatively easy to play. But it's also a perfect example of good jazz improvisation that we can learn a lot from. So let's quickly go through this transcription and talk about what's happening musically. It starts out with this 3-bar lead-in to the top of the form. Listen to these notes, look at them on the page, and tell me if you see or hear any scales. No. It's very clear that there aren't any scale passages whatsoever in these 3 bars. Looking at the chords, though, you can see that this section is entirely diatonic, which means that all the chords are coming out of the same key, and you could, in theory, play the same scale notes over all of it. But what Scott plays is a lot more interesting and comes straight out of the vocabulary and tradition of the music. You can see here he hits the lower neighbor, for example, to the major third 4 times. The line is very melodic, rhythmically interesting, and instead of being scale-based, it is chord tone based. Every note is either a chord tone or an embellishment of a chord tone. The next 4 bars, same thing, chord tones or embellishments of chord tones, like this enclosure here. Next 4 bars, same thing, chord tone based. The entire chorus of this solo is based on outlining the harmony by targeting strong chord tones and connecting them. I'm going to play the entire solo chorus once and just listen. I want you to pay attention to the total lack of any scales being played. It is important to clarify once again, I'm not saying don't learn scales. I am saying that once you learn them, move on to this next step because the scales on their own don't get us very far. Now, you can choose to connect your chord tones with scales, but in the bebop tradition, we very often navigate through our chord tone waypoints using things like enclosures, chromaticism, and arpeggios. And it's not just in this solo. If you listen and transcribe music from the great players, you'll notice that this is happening all the time. If you want to sound like the real thing, you need to know your chords and be able to improvise based on chord tones. So what should you practice? Once you know your scales, and the ones you should learn first in all keys are major, harmonic minor, and the jazz melodic minor. Once you know those, you need to work on arpeggiating chords. And there's so many ways to do this. I give various chord tone exercises every month to the members of the BetterSax studio, and there are endless other resources you can refer to. The big picture is you need to be able to spell all your chords. In September in the Rain, we have major 7, minor 7, and dominant 7 chords. There are a few other chord qualities you need to be able to spell from all 12 starting notes. Then you have to practice playing chord tones over chord progressions. Another great resource for learning to do this is the Rhythmic Pyramid course by Adam Larson, which is available on BetterSax.com. I highly recommend that one. Once you can arpeggiate all your chords, you want to start working on language and vocabulary. A great way to do this is by transcribing and analyzing solos like what we just did here. My 2-5 Win course is a perfect place to start for anybody who wants to take their improvisation to the next level and start sounding more authentic. I'll leave links to everything I'm mentioning in the description below. The main thing I want you to take away from this video is that chord tones are way more important when it comes to improvising than scales are. Once you make that shift in what you practice and how you improvise, you're going to start sounding a lot better. Now, I've got 9 more essential tips about learning to improvise jazz that I wish I had learned earlier. So go watch this video next to find out what they are. You're going to be glad you did.